Hey, thank you so much for watching, listening today. Oh my goodness, I want you to subscribe. Why? We have amazing content on this channel. We have phenomenal jokes and really cool interviews. And speaking of jokes, here's your joke. We're going to start off at a low point and then work our way into some really amazing content. Have you heard the joke about butter? B-U-T-T-E-R? I better not tell you because it might spread. Oh my gosh, that is so horrible. I get it. But seriously, let's look at some really cool content today. And I'm super stoked because we're starting a new series called Road to Wholeness. Voila! This is the newest book by Isabel, my daughter, and me. And it just came out legitimately this month. And it's all about the Good Samaritan and specifically relates to trauma. So I want to talk a little bit about the parable of the Good Samaritan, but let's appreciate what started the parable. Why did Jesus give this parable? What was the premise? Because if we don't understand the premise, then sometimes the meaning doesn't have the same application and punch for us. So the parable, the Good Samaritan, came out of a conversation Jesus had with this Jewish lawyer. And the lawyer comes to Jesus and asks him, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And this is in Luke chapter 10, like verses 25 to 29. And Jesus says, well, how do you read the law? And he says, well, love your neighbor as yourself, love the Lord your God with all your heart. It's interesting because the lawyer says to Jesus, wishing to justify himself, who is my neighbor? And from that question, Jesus goes into the parable of the Good Samaritan, wishing to justify himself. And I think it's interesting because we can all relate to that idea of wanting to justify, explain, give a reason for why we do what we do, or trying to look for the loophole, the way out. But I think it's really interesting what Jesus does when he answers the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor? From that question, it's a springboard into the parable of the Good Samaritan. And as you look at this parable, and you might have heard of it, and just kind of a quick little thumbnail recap, there's a guy walking from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and on the road, he gets jumped by a group of bandits. I call them bandits. And when he's jumped, they beat him to a bloody pulp, half dead, strip him naked, and a priest walks by and keeps walking. A Levite walks by, sees the dude and keeps walking. A Samaritan walks by. He has compassion, and he comes to the man and binds his wounds. When I read this in the Greek, and the word wound in the Greek is the word trauma. And when I read that, all these bells went off because I think this is a buzzword. It's a very common word in our world today. We talk about trauma, and it's been very, very helpful in revealing and in a lot of ways healing for us to learn about trauma. But Jesus spoke about trauma from this very beginning in the Good Samaritan. And with this idea, I want you to think about trauma in your life. Trauma, what is trauma? Well, trauma can be abuse, it can be violence, it can be sexual abuse, it can be neglect or abandonment. You know, you probably heard of PTSD. Sometimes that trauma, we get trauma from a car wreck. I have something in my own psyche. I remember when I was little, I was about 5 years old, we had a trampoline. And when I was growing up, I did a backflip off the trampoline, landed on my head. And I guess I went unconscious and my nose was bleeding. My brother told me this later. But to this day, I'm like 50 years later, I have a struggle with doing anything backwards. I mean, it's just like this instinctual, I freeze, I don't. And I think it goes back to that trauma. And so I think it's really important for us to consider trauma, because I bet there are things that you do today, reactions, instincts, that are rooted in trauma. And so as we talk about this series, just encourage you, think about what is the trauma. Here's a question for you to answer. What is a trauma in your life that still affects you today? So thank you for subscribing. Thank you, of course, for being a part and sharing this with your friends, because I bet you have some friends who have trauma in their lives as well. And if you hit the notification bell right there, you'll get content as we post it, keep it current and fresh for you. So thanks again. Catch you next week.